So I feel like it's been a while since I've done like a beginner level Next.js app router tutorial with server actions, React server components. I figured I'm just going to do a really quick to-do list app. I know to-do list apps are boring, but I do think they cover a lot of the core functionality of what you might need to learn. So we got a Next.js app already set up. I'm not going to walk you through how to set this stuff up, just read the tutorial. But once you have the Next.js project set up, I have a Docker Compose file, which I'm using to run Postgres locally. I do plan to use Drizzle ORM to connect to this Postgres database. And in a terminal, I am doing Docker Compose up, which is basically going to look at this Docker Compose file. It's going to spin up a Postgres database with some default configuration. And then in my .env file, I'm connecting that using this URL. Okay, so we're going to be using this for the ORM part of this tutorial. And then in this terminal, I have my next app running. Okay, let's just make sure this is working. If I go and refresh the page, you can see everything is good. If I go to the main page and just type in like testing, everything should be set up. So let's talk a little bit about Drizzle. I believe you can just do like a Drizzle init and that'll kind of create this config file for you. This is just some information that tells Drizzle where exactly you can connect to. So I'm using Postgres, which is why you have driver PG. I'm passing it the credentials that come from that .env file. And there's some additional things you need to pass it. If you do plan to use migration scripts, you need to give it a location where to write those migration scripts. And then you have the schema file. Okay, this is the most important part of what we're going to build, a to-do list application. So let's look at the schema, and then we're going to jump into Next.js and try to interact with our database to read and write data. So in the schema file, this is where we can tell Drizzle like what our tables are going to look like in Postgres. So if you're using Postgres, you need to make sure that the imports you're using come from PG core. If you're using MySQL, there'll be a different package that you need to import from. And once you have that imported, you can actually start creating tables. So I'm going to go ahead and say const todos is equal to PG table. You're going to put the table name here, and then you can start defining columns on that table. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just put in auto incrementing ID and set that as the primary key. I'm going to add a completed property so we know if the to-do list item is done or not. You can also default stuff to false and true. So I'm going to say make a column called completed and default it to false. And then finally some text, so you can actually type in what the to-do list item needs to say. Secondly, what you can do is you're going to want to use the data model type throughout your code base. So you can actually export a type called to-do. Just say type of todos.infer select. And that just gives you a nice type you can use as you're like reading and writing data. So now that we have the schema set up, what we want to do is we want to tell Drizzle to take the schema and apply any changes that we did to our Postgres database that's running locally. Okay, so I'm going to say npx drizzle kit. I'll say push PGs. Now, before I actually try to apply the schema changes, I'm going to go to my tsconfig file and I'm going to change this to ESNext so that when we run this command, npx drizzle kit push PG, it's going to properly run. Otherwise, I've seen it crash without changing the actual target with like some TypeScript error. So now that the changes are applied to our database, one thing I want to show you is what DrizzleKit is. So DrizzleKit is a library, like a toolkit, for basically taking your schema changes, applying those changes to your table. But also you can run npx DrizzleKit Studio, and this is going to load up a locally running application where you can actually view that to-do list table that you just created. So this is a useful approach if you don't want to install like a Postgres database viewer. The Studio is a great way to just kind of come in here. You can add items, you can delete items, you can edit items directly in this table. So let's go back. We have the schema set up. We have the tables and columns created in our database. Now what we want to do is we want to start modifying our Next.js application to allow users to create to-do items and then display those. So let's first start with creating a to-do item. So I'm going to make a form here. I'm going to make an input, and then I'm also going to make a button. I'll just call the button create to do. And then inside the input, let's just give it a name, and we can call it text like this. So I'm going to try to use server actions in this video. But if you need more rich client-side features, that's when you want to kind of dive into using the use client directive at the top. But for right now, let's just keep it simple. So what we want to do is when the user types in some text here and they click on this button, we want to call some functionality to basically persist this to our database, right? So I'm going to go ahead and on the form, I can say action, and then we are going to go ahead and just I'll call a function here. Inside that function, I'm going to say use server. This is how you can define an inline server action. You can also pull that out and put it in another file, which I'll probably do in a bit. So I do want to reiterate, this function runs on your backend. So you have access to any environment variables, you have access to connecting to a database. And what Next.js does is when you use a server action, is basically abstracting away that HTTP call for you. And you don't have to worry about doing like an Axios fetch with method type post. It just kind of does that for you. So what we want to do is when someone submits this form, we want to get the text that they passed in. So what you could do here, you could say form data, which is a type of form data. We're using TypeScript, of course. And we're going to go ahead and get that text. So I'm going to say const text form data dot get. And we're going to put the name of that input right here. Okay, now you do have to kind of cast this. I'm going to say as string. Now we're getting an error down here. This is something that's important. Whenever you're using a server actions, you must put async in front of your function. Okay. And now everything should be good. Let's go ahead and close that. So now that we have the text, we need to persist that data into Postgres, right? How do we do that? Well, we have an ORM called Drizzle, which I can just import. Sometimes you can auto import it. For right now, I'm just not letting me auto import. So I'm going to say import db from, I'm going to say @ symbol, and then I'm going to say db. That's it. Okay. Now I haven't shown you what this db index file looks like. It looks a little complicated. The reason for this is that Next.js, when running locally, will continuously create new connections to your Postgres database. And at some point, you'll just get too many error connections and like your stuff just will stop working. So this is basically a way to cache a global connection when you're running locally so that you don't get that issue. Just copy and paste into your project. You don't need to understand it. But if you do take time to understand it, that would be good. All right, so since I've shown you that and we've imported this db object, we can say db dot, and then we want to insert into, we can go ahead and import that table. Remember over here in the schema, we're exporting a to-dos table. Well, let's go ahead and try to import that like this. And then we're going to go ahead and say values. And then we want to persist the text here, okay? And that is the only required field. The other one completed is defaults. And then the ID is auto incrementing. Let's also just put in a wait on this. So like we can wait till this is all done. I know it looks bad. We probably won't even worry about styling. That's not the important part. I want to show you the actual like logic and functionality part of things. If you want to get a nice looking UI, you're going to end up using ShadCN or Chakra or just Tailwind components or something. But let's just type in a text item here. I'll say clean your room. Now, for some reason, the text is white. I might actually go here and just make this class name text to black so we can view it. But if I were to go ahead and load up my console and go to network, I want to show you how the abstraction of server actions are working. I'm going to go ahead and click create to do. And notice that it makes a post request. If I click this and go to headers, you'll see it does a post request to the same exact endpoint that you're currently on. So we're on the base route here. And if you go to payload, it sends over some really weird stuff. Now this stuff is used by Next.js and React to understand what server action was abstracted away when you wrote this code. And it basically uses this ID to figure out and call that action with your parameters. Notice here you have your arguments of form data passed in. And it has some other information that you probably don't care about. So that's how that's working. I just want you to know that it is calling a backend endpoint. It's passing your data. And then your code on the backend is going to run. Okay, how do we know if this actually worked? Let's go back to Drizzle Studio. All right, there we go. So the item was persisted to our database. So that's the first part of creating a to-do list application, is how do you create to-do list items? There's more stuff we're going to dive into, like how do you clear out this input and how do you like show a spinner when you submit stuff. But let's just focus on the basics for right now. Okay, so again, this is an inline server action. Some may argue you should probably make an actions file, and that's actually what I kind of do on a lot of my projects. Any of the actions that your route calls, I typically just make a use server file called actions.tsx, and then I grab the server action like this, and I'll say export async function create to do action. I typically always put the action suffix so I know for myself this is a server action when I'm invoking it. And then you can kind of delete a lot of this stuff. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just bring in those and do that. So same code, just abstracted away into a file to hopefully make your component a little bit cleaner. So now we can call create to do action like that, and everything will work exactly the same. Let's just verify it. I'm going to say like hello world. I'll click create to do, go over here, click refresh, and it shows up. Okay, so now how do we display the to do? Okay, again, in App Router, you have React Server components. These are run on the server when you hit the URL. So you get the ability to basically fetch some data from the backend whenever you need to. I'm going to bring over those imports again, and I'm going to put an async in front of this so that we can actually call some database code in the backend. Then I'm going to say const todos, and I'm going to say await db query. Now with Drizzle, this query object, it acts a little bit different from that select we just did. You can do a dot, and you'll see your table name already show up. Okay, so I'm going to say db query to-dos. I'm going to say find many and just call it. And that's going to return every to-do list item that's in your database. Okay, so this should be an array of to-dos. And if you look over it, the type says array of to-dos. So we should be good. Now what we want to do is inside of our page somewhere, we want to map over all those to-dos we just got. And we probably want to render out some type of thing. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just do LIs. I'm going to say the key is to-do of ID. And then inside of this itself, I'm going to say to-do of text. All right, now I'm also going to wrap this in a UL, an unordered list. Give it a class name of list disk so that it kind of displays a little bit nicer. Now if I go back to my page, notice that we see these to-do list items show up in the top. Does that make sense? So now we're actually fetching from the database when this page loads. Now, one thing I would recommend is I don't like just having database calls directly in your components. I would have some type of data access layer. So I'm going to say data access, and then I'm going to go ahead and put a new file here called todos.tsx. And we're going to try to abstract away this logic into a function. So I'm going to say export async function get all to-dos. Go ahead and just return that. Okay, we're going to have to import this stuff again. That's my rule of thumb. You don't have to follow this. I would say that you shouldn't be doing ORM calls or database calls inside your React Server components. I personally would get some type of abstraction so that you can actually just call a method, and that method knows how to connect to whatever database that you're using. Second thing I would potentially do is this component, Next doesn't know that this is a dynamic component, okay? So we are fetching dynamic data, but when you actually build this, Next is going to think that this is a static page. So at the top of this component, I would definitely say put no store like this. And that's going to tell Next, so when you build this component, make sure that it's marked as a dynamic endpoint or dynamic route and not a static route. Otherwise, it's going to try to like fetch data on build. It's going to try to have it populate like a static page, and then you're going to have a lot of caching issues. So when you're doing like database ORM calls, make sure you either put this, or another approach you can do is export dynamic equals force dynamic. I'm sorry, put a constant in front of that. Now, I would probably recommend using this unstable no store. At some point, it's going to become stable, and this is going to be the approach where you can mark individual components as dynamic, and then it traverses your component tree and figures out if the top level root needs to be dynamic or not. That's too much information. I'm sorry. So let's keep going. All right. So the next thing we want to do is how do you delete to-do items? Okay. So on this to-do item itself, one thing that we could potentially do is put a button here. Now we are using server action, so I would say let's put a form, and inside that form, let's put a button, and I'm going to say delete. Now I might do a little bit of styling just so it doesn't look so terrible. So on this LI, I'm going to go ahead and just say flex gap of 2 items center, and that should put the button and the text side by side. Okay. And then on the button itself, let's just go ahead and say the class name, and I'll say like text red 400. But when you click on this button, you want it to do something. You want it to delete the to-do item based on the to-do ID that you're currently looped over. So how do you do that? Well, let's first of all go to our actions file. Let's copy this existing function, and we're going to go ahead and just like call one called delete to-do action. So we're going to basically try to get the ID. So I'm going to say const ID is equal to form data.get to-do ID. Okay. And then what we want to do is we're going to say await db dot delete. You can pass it to-dos. And then you can say where. So this is a weird thing about Drizzle. There's actually like an equal function you have to bring in. And you have to put the column, so I'll say to-dos ID. And then we're going to go ahead and pass ID here. Now I think it's going to complain because this actually needs to be parse int. And this needs to be as string. There. So now when I click this button, it's going to run this code, which tries to delete from the to-dos table where the column name ID matches the value ID that we passed in. Let's go back to our main app, and we're going to go back, and on this form, I'm going to say action, delete to-do action. Make sure you auto import that. There you go. Now let's try this out. Let's see if this works. If I were to click on this, so it's crashing because when it tried to run this action, it couldn't find this to-do ID, and it tried to parse a null or undefined, and it crashed. So when you have this type of approach and you have some like context or metadata that you want to be attached to the action, one approach you can do is you can do a type hidden input, and you can give it a value of to-do ID. Okay. So now let's try it again. I'm going to go ahead and just click delete here. And it should have ran. I didn't see anything crash. It did that post request. We got a 200 status code back right here. And if I go to DrizzleKit and refresh, notice that the item is gone. But the issue, it still shows the hello world item. Like we just clicked that to delete it, but it's still showing. The one thing that you'll end up doing when it comes to Next.js is inside your server actions, after you modify data, when you run a mutation, you need to run a revalidate path. And then you need to put the current path that the user might be on and tell Next.js that you need to just refresh, grab a clean slate copy of this React server component. It basically runs through this code again, recomputes the changed data, and it sends that back over to the front end where the front end Next app router can kind of rehydrate the page. So let's try this. I'm going to go ahead and click delete now, and notice that it does delete it from the page. So that concept, very important. Make sure to revalidate path. You understand? There's also a revalidate tag, which I will not get to in this video, but that's if you're doing like a fetch request, you want to put a specific tag on that fetch request. Or if you're doing a Postgres request, you can actually tag that function with something specific, and you can revalidate it later. This one also has that same issue. If you go back and type in some information here and click create to do, it doesn't show that new to do you just created. So again, we got to copy this revalidate path, and we got to put it right here. And I'm going to go ahead and just type in some hello world, click enter, and there you go. It's going to go ahead and just repopulate that. All right, so I want to kind of show you a different approach. Instead of having these hidden inputs, which I personally don't like, one approach you can actually do is on the action itself, you can have the to-do ID be passed in as an argument. In fact, I'll just call it ID. And then I'm going to go ahead and just run this code. Okay, so when you do this, if you don't want to pass a form data object, what you can do instead is you can actually say .bind, you say null, and you say the actual argument you want to pass in. So now you can get rid of that hidden input. And to me, I like this better because now you have this type safety, and you don't have to worry about parsing form data, passing it as a string. It's just easier just to say this takes in a number, and then when you use it, it'll already be a number. Okay, so let's just show you how that works. I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to click delete. Works just the same way. There's like one or two more things I'm going to kind of show in this video. I'm not going to get like super in depth about everything. This is just a short little introduction to App Router with Drizzle ORM. When you click on this create to do button, if you have a slow network speed, you probably want to show some type of loader or spinner, right? So I'm going to show you how to do that. On this button itself, we're actually going to abstract this away into a client component. I'm going to go here. I'm going to make a new file called submitButton.tsx. And I'm going to put use client at the top because we're going to be using some React hook functionality. So I'm going to say export function submit button. And we want to bring in a hook that might be new to you if you haven't seen this. So I'm going to say equals useFormStatus. And what this allows you to do is you can get access to a pending method. So what you could do is we're going to take that button that was on this page. We're going to return this button, but we're going to use that pending Boolean, and we're going to display different text depending on if the form is currently submitting. I'll say creating to do ... or we're going to say create to do. Now, what this allows you to do is you basically want to use this client component somewhere nested inside of a form. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and use it here like this. Go ahead and import that. And now if we have a slow network speed, okay, I'm going to go ahead and just say slow 3G. If I click on this button, notice that it says creating to do. And then when the form is done submitting, it'll go ahead and change the text back to what it was. Now notice that weird flash. That's a tailwind issue that you'll only see locally on slow network. When you actually build this and deploy it, that flash seems to go away. So I wouldn't worry about that flash too much. All right, another thing I want to show you is the input is not clearing when we submit the form. So notice I create the item and it still says hello. Not the best user experience. How do we actually clear out this input after we submit? The easiest way is to use a client component. Okay, so this has implications if you want this application to work with JavaScript disabled. So if I go to my terminal, say Command-Shift-P and say JavaScript, and I want to disable it, notice that this app will still work even though JavaScript is disabled. But if you're building an application, that's not something that you care about. Again, progressively enhancement, maybe you don't care about that. Maybe the 2-3% of people on the internet who use applications without JavaScript you don't care, because you're building a really highly rich dynamic application. So you always want JavaScript enabled. This is the approach I'm going to show you. So you can basically take your entire form, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to make a create to do form.tsx file. Just go ahead and export create to do form. I'm going to return this. Make sure you put use client at the top, because we are going to be using some hooks and stuff. And I'm going to import the submit button. And let's just go ahead and put that create to do form there. Okay, so what we want to do is when the form is done submitting, we want to clear out the form. So since this create to do form is now a client component, you can just go back to traditional React. So I can just go ahead and say on submit and pass this a callback function that takes in an E. And then we can say const form data is equal to new form data e.target. We can pass that form data into the original server action here. And definitely don't forget to say e.prevent default so that the form doesn't submit like it normally does. And then we're going to go ahead and just say .then. So after the actual item is created, I'm going to say e.target.reset. Now we're getting some TypeScript errors. So what I would recommend doing is you can actually say const form is equal to e.target as HTML form element, so that we can get this going without all these TypeScript errors. All right, let's try it out. So now if I go and just refresh the page just to make sure there's no caching, I can go ahead and submit the form and it clears out the input after I submit. Some other approaches, you could probably put a ref on the form itself and have like a useRef hook, and then you can just call ref.current.reset if you want to there. But this is probably the easiest approach that you can do if you want to use client components and you don't care if JavaScript is required for your application to work. I do want to show you how you can get a form and server actions working with progressive enhancement, like just in case that you do have a need to have this work without JavaScript. There's another hook that we're going to bring in called useFormState. And what this does is it returns two things. It's going to return your form state, and then it's also your wrapped, I'll say wrapped create to do action. Okay, and the way this works is you say use form state, you pass it your current server action that you want, but then you also pass it some initial state. So in our case, we're going to say like text, and we'll set it equal to empty string, and we'll say errors text undefined. Okay, so now what we can do is instead of doing it on submit, because remember this is not going to work when JavaScript is turned off, we're going to go back to just using that wrapped create to do action. And we're going to put some things on this input, like we're going to say default value is going to be equal to form state of text. And we are getting some TypeScript errors, so I'm going to fix that real quick. So if we go back to the action, if you're going to invoke an action using this useFormState, you actually have to give it a first parameter here. So I'm going to say previous state, and we're just going to go ahead and use the exact same type that we had defined in the front end. So if I go over here and grab this type structure, I'm going to go ahead and just put it here. And we're going to use form state as like our type definition for that. And then I would probably just like wrap this so you can actually make sure it's proper. And what you need to do now is you basically want to add some validation. So I want to say, like, for example, if text is not defined, we're going to return the new state of the form. So I'm going to say return, and then we'll say text. It's just going to be, you know, whatever the user just entered from the form data. But then we're going to say errors. We'll say text. Text must be defined. And then finally down here, you have to return something, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say return text of empty string. That'll clear it out. And then errors, I'll just say text of undefined. I do think I want to make this be a string or undefined. I had a little typo here. That needs to be string, not an empty string. I'm going to go back to the component. I'm going to say if formState.errors.text. And we want to display a div. And we're going to go ahead and just print out what the error message is. We'll say class name is equal to text red 400. And that should hopefully display some errors when you don't have any input filled in. Okay, so it says text must be defined. So I do want to share with you, if you have more complex validation, this will hopefully explain why we are doing like this default value thing here. So let's say you have a check that says make sure text is always equal to hello. And we're going to go ahead and return an error saying text must match hello. If you don't have the default value set, so for example, we're just taking the previous thing that they submitted in the form request and we're returning that in the new state. If you didn't do this, for example, like if you didn't set default value here, what will actually happen is that this input will just clear out. So if I type in something and click enter, I'm sorry, this needs to be not equal to hello. But if I go back to the UI and I just go ahead and try to enter something and submit it, notice that this works fine when you have JavaScript turned on. But if I turn off JavaScript, go ahead and type in some information, click enter, notice that it clears out your input. But that's kind of a bad user experience. You don't want to just clear out what the person had typed in. Maybe they have a form of 20 inputs and you just cleared everything out. So that's why we're basically returning the previous text that was used. And then we use that as the default value here. So that as errors are happening and you're doing form validation, you can just kind of keep on filling in the input with the previous thing that they entered in. So now if I were to type this in, press enter, notice that it doesn't clear out. So I know this useFormState was probably a little bit more complex and it's kind of different from what you're normally used to in React. Maybe use like useFormHook in React. But if you do want that progressive enhancement, this is kind of the approach that you have to take, where you have to use this formState object and you kind of end up passing it back and forth between the action to keep track of what the state needs to be when the page refreshes and re-renders. All right, so let's move on to the kind of the last feature of a to-do list application where you need checkboxes or ability to mark things as completed or not. Now, if you do want to keep progressive enhancement in mind, it's going to be harder if you have a checkbox because you can't really submit forms without JavaScript just by clicking on a checkbox, right? So I'm going to bring in a library called Lucid React, which has a bunch of different like icons. So let's just go ahead and install that real quick. Let's just make sure this works. I'm going to go ahead and say like square icon. Make sure that we can get a square displayed. There we go. And then we're also going to add in a check square icon, I think it's called. There we go. So the idea, again, I'm not using the input checkbox because you can't really submit a form when you click on a checkbox, at least that I know of, without using JavaScript. And if you want this to be progressively enhanced, it's probably better to stick with just buttons to begin with. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if to do completed, then we want to show the check square. Otherwise, we're going to show the square icon. So by default, these are not completed. But what we could do is we could actually make a form here and we can wrap this whole entire thing inside of a button. And we can make this call an action called toggle to do action. Okay. Now when they click on this button, it should hopefully toggle this from completed to not completed. So let's go back to our actions and we're going to go ahead and go to the bottom. I'll say export async function, toggle the action. We'll say number. We need to know what the to-do list ID was. So the way this action is going to work, I'm going to say const to do is equal to await db.query.todos. I'll say find first, and then I can say where eq to-dos ID is equal to ID, right? We did this before in a previous function. And now we actually get the to-do item, and we can say, let's just update. So db update to-dos set completed equal to to-do.completed, and we're going to negate it. And then we want to do that where, and then we're going to do the same thing here. So I know in SQL there's probably a way to do this without having to first fetch the item and then update it. I might come back and try to figure that out. But for right now, I think this should work. So if I were to just call the toggle to do action from here, make sure you bind it because we want to pass in that ID, and import it. And then finally, again, when you mutate data, make sure you call revalidate path, or else your page will show stale data. All right, let's just go ahead and click on this. And notice that it did check the thing that we selected. I'll be honest, I don't know why it's changing the ordering. Let's just go ahead and try A, B, C. If I checked B, I don't know why it's changing the ordering there. I think maybe here, the get all to-dos, it looks like you can provide an order by. So I might actually just do that. They find many and then order by. We'll do ascending, and we're just going to do order by to-dos of text. Actually, we probably just do it by ID, I think. Make sure we import to-dos from schema. And so now that should hopefully every time we fetch data from the database, it won't just like change the ordering of it. Now again, all this is working with JavaScript disabled. So go back and enable JavaScript. This will still work with JavaScript enabled as well. But it's just a fun little challenge, like can you build a UI that actually works if people have JavaScript turned off? And that's the whole purpose of progressive enhancement. All right, that's all I wanted to do in this video. We have a really basic to-do list application. You can create items, delete items, and update the completed state on that item. Super basic. I think it's all good information. So if you did enjoy watching this, give me a thumbs up. Like always, be sure to join my Discord if you want a place to hang out or talk to other developers. And like always, have a good day and happy coding.